able to do some things that we could never have done otherwise. And some of you are joining. You wouldn't be able to join us otherwise. So some amazing things have gone on. I'd mentioned next week, this is going to be amazing. I've got Bishop Kenneth Carter, that's Carder, not my other friend, Kenneth Carter, Kenneth Carter. And we're going to talk about dementia and the Christian faith. He's just put out a book on this from his personal experience with his wife, Linda. That's going to be an amazing conversation. We've got a thing the week after that about Black spirituals and how they came to be with Dwalla Simmons-Burke, Winston-Salem State choir director. A lot of cool things that are coming up. Today, we're going to talk about Abraham Lincoln and the Bible. And I've got a great expert that I'm going to introduce to you in a moment. Let me just show you a few pictures first. Abraham Lincoln, of course, everybody knows Lincoln. Gosh, the Lincoln Memorial in D.C. has been vandalized in recent days. Good grief. Anyway, Lincoln's absolutely amazing. I've been reading some about him lately. And we take his visage for granted, but back in the day, people said he's ugly. Well, that's an unusual looking person. And Lincoln's Bible is a thing. Let's look at that slide. I first saw this Lincoln Bible on display at the Library of Congress in Washington. Took my children there. And that was amazing to see. This isn't actually the Bible that he read day by day. This is a Bible that someone gave him to use in his first inaugural. We got a photo of that. This is amazing. The early days of photography. We say things like Lincoln's first inaugural. Look at the Capitol dome still under being replaced there. Amazing. The crowd gathers. So Lincoln was sworn in with that Bible at the first inaugural. You know, he was reelected toward the end of the Civil War. So the second inaugural, we have photos of that. This is a haunting photo. It's got people that can be spotted in it, like John Wilkes Booth, right? And Lincoln's speech in the second inaugural, we're going to spend some time talking about this. To me, it's just the wisest, most profound understanding of the Bible that I think I've ever read anywhere from anybody, theologians included. It was President Lincoln. Absolutely amazing. That Bible now has resurfaced in recent years. Barack Obama was when he was sworn in, he put his hand on that Bible. You can see it there. And then when Donald Trump at his inauguration, the same Bible, they'd keep it in a box to preserve it there. It's interesting to me. This is a bipartisan comment that our presidents still are sworn in with their hand on the Bible. And if we said, let's don't do that, people would get hysterical. My question is, you know, if that's an important thing, maybe we ought to hold our presidents accountable to, I don't know, read the thing or do the stuff that's in there. If Bible matters, I don't know. That's just a different question. That's bipartisan. That's all presidents. Anyway, so that's just a thing. Let me, with that background, bring on our guest today. I'm so excited that he has joined us, Dr. Vernon Burton. Vernon has become a friend over the years. He's just a marvelous guy. He's absolutely brilliant. He's got an encyclopedic mind, remembers everything. He is a scholar of American history, teaches it. It's hard for me to say it. Clemson. I'm a Gamecock. What do you do? Anyway, and he published a book, The Age of Lincoln, that's garnered many awards. He's written about the civil rights movement. He wrote a great piece on Harvey Gantt, former mayor here in Charlotte. Vernon, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you're well. You're down in the huge metropolis of 96.
Almost. We're a few miles outside in the country.
That's really out in the country. You're in the suburbs of 96. You and Georgianne doing well, I hope.
We are.
Good. So let me ask you a couple things about Lincoln. I always carried around this notion that Lincoln, you know, he never joined a church. He was hostile to religion. And that's sort of an image that's been carried. I read a book recently by this guy, Stephen Mansfield, where he really charts what he believes is the development in Lincoln's faith. That early he had quarrels with the church, he had quarrels with the Bible and quarrels with God. A lot of that emerging from kind of some tacky revivalistic preaching that he'd heard, but also from suffering. He lost his mother at a young age, lost a son. really wrestled deeply with all of those things. But Mansfield believed that Lincoln over time really came to a really deep faith, became a great reader of the Bible, had a great understanding of things. What would you say about just Lincoln generally and his faith, his approach to the Bible? Was he an irreligious guy or a profoundly religious guy?
I think that assessment is really correct. And you can go back, and I think historians and others who saw Lincoln and made the argument, part of it, of course, Lincoln never officially joined the church, but that was not unusual. A lot of people went to church, but many did not join the church. Um, and the other thing
This
is
is
that his
still
law
true
partner,
today.
yes, yes. His law partner tried, who so much of what we know about Lincoln in the early days, Herndon, tried to present him as sort of the Tom Paine of the prairie, sort of the age of reason. And there's evidence when he was a young man in New Salem, he was with a group that discussed the divinity question of Jesus, the virgin birth, but it was an intellectual group that discussed it. And I think what people miss, they go back to Lincoln's father, who was a devout, hard shell Baptist, but it's also where Lincoln got his strong anti-slavery views. This group of Baptists were extraordinary anti-slavery. And Lincoln did not like the emotional preaching. And so as a young boy, he would entertain the other children by mimicking the uh, the sermon that the pastor just given. Then his dad had beat him pretty badly for being irreligious, which is all true. But we forget, if you study comics today and mimics, you have to understand what you are mimicking. So some of those very things that he was beat for his father by are some of the great words we hear today that came from his heart. And I think it is absolutely true, as he tried to make sense of the tragedy in his life, as he tried to make sense of the tragedy of the Civil War, he turned closer and closer to God. One of my favorite statements to understand where Lincoln really stood is when he was leaving his stepmother, and she said, after he was elected, said, I'll never see you again. They'll kill you, because the turmoil at that time of the Civil War. Not unlike what we have today in terms of the divisions, the sort of what we call red blue states today, the South and the North, and how people were dividing up. And he says to her, who knows him so well, his stepmother who had raised him and loved him as her own, says, it's all in God's hands. Trust in God. I will see you again. Of course, he did not. And then when he's writing to his very best friend, a man whom, if Lincoln had anyone that he was intimate with besides Mary Lincoln, his wife, who knew him the best, Joshua Speed, and Speed is wondering about his own faith. And Lincoln says to him, take all the Bible you can believe in and accept it. And what you can't, he says, take by faith. It is the best. And he goes on and on again and again. And you see it during the Civil War, it really comes out. And Lincoln is such a very careful man and politician. So the crafted Gettysburg Address, the crafted Second Inaugural, you want to know what Lincoln really thinks? Get it when it was impromptu. And then when he's leaving Springfield, he makes this incredible statement to his neighbors. These are the people that knew him, he had lived with. And he makes a statement a lot of people are focused on, so while he's comparing himself to George Washington about the task he has to save the nation. But the main thing he says is, pray for me, because I can't do this without God's help, that I need God to save the Union. And with God, I can do this. And I think that is Lincoln and Lincoln's faith coming out. And we can see it as it grows in the Civil War in extraordinary ways as he comes to understand providence. I argued in the age of Lincoln, when I was a little surprised when I came back south that things had changed so much. The cultural wars had not been kind, that Lincoln was not only a Southerner, but the greatest president, but also the greatest theologian of the 19th century. He's my favorite of the 19th century. I sort of play off a historian named Mark Noll there, who doesn't quite say that, but comes close. As you are my favorite of the 20th century. So there you go. I put you and Lincoln in different centuries, but very similar actually on your theologies.
The I agree with you about Lincoln's theology. I want to get to the second inaugural here in a minute. I'm struck by to me, Lincoln is an exemplary reader of the Bible in that, he doesn't seem interested in doing what some people do. It's like he pulls out one Bible verse and says, or oh, here, this makes me feel warm and fuzzy. Lincoln wrestled deeply with not just the words of Scripture, but with the heart of Scripture. I was reading this other book the other day about a guy talking about Lincoln and Shakespeare and how Lincoln loved Shakespeare, but he very rarely quoted lines from Shakespeare. He could do it from memory, and people saw him do it all the time. But in his speeches, he didn't say, "As King Lear." He didn't do that much. He also doesn't quote Bible that much. But if you understand the Bible and then you read Lincoln's speeches, they're just allusions and they're everywhere. But he gets to that by wrestling deeply. He's not afraid to ask any questions. Sometimes people just say, "Oh, just accept the Bible, just believe, whatever." But that's God doesn't want that from us. God wants us to wrestle with it, to ask hard questions, to keep wrestling with it, to ask harder questions, to link it to the hardest struggles of our world. And we need this kind of thing today because we find ourselves in a very broken, troubled world. Let's talk about that second inaugural, which is good grief, the accumulation of wisdom and insight. It was absolutely stunning. I guess it was stunning at the time, right? When he made this speech, people had to just be, because I would assume people expected him to say, "The North is winning and God has triumphed over his foes," and he doesn't do that at all. Talk about that speech.
You're exactly right. In fact, if you read the diaries at the time, the people who are coming there, they want that. They want to be justified that they have lost their father, their brother, their husband. They want to say it is, the fault of the North and this war, and it's all about that. And Lincoln does not. And let me just give a little background. There was very little clapping at the second hour. Of course, it is only 701 words, 2 or 3. It's amazing how short it is. And I have argued, and I think I am correct, that Lincoln came to read the Bible as a lot of Jewish scholars do, and certainly as African American theology has, as a corporate God working through history with his people. And Lincoln, I honestly believe how Lincoln comes to where he is, particularly with Southern honor. People forget that Lincoln honor was so important. He was willing to fight a duel, went to the Mississippi River, and couldn't even run for office because dueling was illegal in Illinois. But by the time of the Civil War, he's come to understand honor in a different way out of Matthew, humility. And he's always humble. There's a tremendous humility, I think, something we can learn from Lincoln in all he does. But there's very little clapping. Then at the end, you begin to hear from the back of the crowd, "Bless the Lord, bless the Lord." And it is African Americans, none who had probably ever been at an inauguration before. This is new. And it captures the crowd, that crowd, those people understood what Lincoln was doing. It's also to give you a little bit of historical context. And you stop me, James, if I'm going off on a tangent where you don't want to go.
No.
Okay, please.
You go.
All right. Before this inaugural, as I said, this except for one of Washington's who didn't want to be reelected and just sort of I can imagine just want to say goodbye, folks. This was the shortest. At the same time, God had only been used or evoked at the very end of inaugural addresses, and it was in like "God bless our nation," the end. Lincoln evokes God 4 times, the Bible 4 times, twice from the New Testament, twice from the Old Testament. And you're right, this book that he had really put to memory, the Bible, he's able throughout his career, he used the Bible in metaphors. And the people understood. One of the reasons so many slave owners really despised Lincoln was his House Divided speech, where Jesus is sort of calling, I mean, the implication is Satan's, and that slavery is the devil. And so they understood that his purifying the robes, all of these were metaphors. Even his labor speech, where he talks about a blind horse. That all of these metaphors come from the Bible. In the second inaugural, he speaks to them so strongly with this. Really, the center of it, that third paragraph, is the Sermon on the Mount. And remember, this is Jesus's humility. Again, the meek shall inherit the earth. And you can go on and on and on. One of the things that, and this is a little bit of a tangent, but I've only discovered this myself fairly recently, as I've been looking at Lincoln and African Americans and the similarity of the theology. He makes a statement there that is often overlooked, that as we bind up the nation's wounds, but we finish the task, and we are going to take care of the widows and orphans. Lincoln has done something for the first time. He is proclaiming, he puts this in the context of what he said about Black soldiers helping to win this war, and what he's arguing about African Americans to vote, to keep the liberty. And he also uses metaphors there, not in the second hour. These are all in private letters, typical Lincoln. So what he is doing there is recognizing for the first time from the federal government that African Americans who had been enslaved had legal marriages and have rights to citizenship. And that's one of the first times, and people like Booth understood that, what a departure this was. So the second inaugural is I've always argued that the Gettysburg Address was sort of Lincoln's benediction, and that the second inaugural is his Sermon on the Mount.
That's well said. The length of those speeches, the Gettysburg Address, this Everett guy had spoken before Lincoln, talked for 2 hours. Nobody remembered anything that he said. Lincoln, 269 words. It was amazing. So those of us who preach, we ramble on too long. And Vernon, I know you tune into our worship services. And the first Sunday of the pandemic, when we first didn't have people in the building, I quoted that second inaugural because I think it's a timely word and a deep understanding of what the Bible's about. The Bible's not a weapon to divide us. The Bible's not a weapon to judge other people. The Bible is, Lincoln talked about, with malice toward none. We have so much malice today. It's like people feel like that's the holy thing, is to have malice. But Lincoln understood at a time that there was so much tension in the country that what the Bible was about, it was with malice toward none. And we will try to, heal the wounds of the nation. But the other thing Lincoln does there that's absolutely amazing is that he looks at history not as some random unfolding of events, or the big guys beat the little guys, sort of a Darwinian reading of things. But Lincoln looked at everything that had gone on, and he saw God in it, right? So he talks about how both sides prayed to the same God, both sides thought God was on their side, and he says the Almighty has his own purposes. We need always to remember that. But what he does is really what the biblical prophets did, right? So if you go to Jeremiah and Ezekiel, they live at the time that the Babylonians have overrun the city of Jerusalem, and they're ruling the world, and Israel's, it's just disaster. And people is, woe is me, is God going to help us? And what the prophets tried to help the people to see is that in all of this, we can see God's judgment on us. Lincoln does this with the war. It wasn't like good guys against bad guys, which side are you on, but the whole war, the whole carnage. So that was sort of God's verdict on a country that had accepted slavery. And it wasn't just North and South. It's not like Northerners, love their African American brothers up there. There was so much racism and hatred up there. They just had different views of the institution of slavery. Vernon, you mentioned to me before we came on the air about a letter that Lincoln wrote that you were referring to. Talk about that.
Yeah,
I
there's
know
a
you wrote a
letter.
lot
I
of
can't
letters.
remember if I included it. I know I wanted to. I had to do a little book, or I was asked to do a little book. It was the hardest thing to choose 30 documents to show Lincoln's change over time, called The Essential Lincoln. I think I put it in there, but it's primarily known by theologians and historians. And he writes a little thing to himself about God's will and providence. And before I forget, James, I do want to mention that the Gettysburg Address is often overlooked, that Lincoln is clearly talking about the new birth of freedom is one can be born again. I mean, that is, when you spoke of those metaphors, that's so important that I put it together with the other. But he talks about the providence of God. Now, this is not in the letter, but it helps explain the letter. I should have pulled it up to remember exactly. But it's where, particularly, most Protestant men had a very simple view of God, very simple, of providence and America's providence, that it was God's nation, etc., blessed by God. That's not what Lincoln saw. In fact, in a conversation, some ministers were with him and telling him, you shouldn't worry about this war because God's on our side. And Lincoln responded, as he loved to use humor. He said, well, don't you think if God was on our side, he would let the commander know and have some indication? And then another time, they were saying, Lincoln stated, it's not so important to me that God is on our side, the Union. It's much more important if I can be on God's side as I come to understand that. And I think that was Lincoln's simplicity, humility, but also profound theological insight, that in this terrible war, instead of justifying it through God, through this, that it's more important to be on God's side than God be on our side. I think that's incredible if you think about it, particularly how almost all the ministers at that time, particularly Protestant ministers, were presenting the war and presenting sort of the enemies as devils and evil. Uh, and that's part of what the horrors of war is all about, is making the enemies the other. I'm afraid that we see that a lot today on both sides, and it really disturbs me. Lincoln, I mean, we think of Lincoln as this great war president, but Lincoln, his whole life, was a compromiser. I mean, he was always trying to get people to work it out. He would tell people in his law practice, if we go to court, the only person that's going to get anything out of this is going to be me. Let's settle this. We don't need to go to court. He was an excellent trial lawyer, and he won some incredible cases. It wasn't that he didn't want to go, but he believed in it. Henry Clay, the great compromiser, was his beau ideal. And I think part of that is an insight that Lincoln got from his early childhood, that he believed sincerely that all people are the children of God. There's a God spark created by God in all of us. And therefore, he really never held malice toward anyone. He couldn't understand why others would feel so strongly hating him or others. He did not have that sense of malice. And he's put that on the national stage. And it's time to revisit what he's saying in that great second inaugural, I really think. I think he's a good role model for us today, and particularly for theology that is not a simple feel-good theology. Uh, when Lincoln's son, he had all these children die, and it was so hard on he and Mary. There's arguments that Mary really just, I mean, it was more than she could bear. And Lincoln had a minister into his home to preach the funeral and sort of counsel them. And the minister said to him, the best way for you to deal with this is read the Bible and understand providence. And I think that second inaugural is Lincoln's explanation of the tragedy of both his son's death and of all the death in the Civil War.
So that
You
I
know,
think that same.
everyone claims Lincoln.
No, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I think that
No,
same
it's all right.
Episcopal priest visiting. Somebody had emailed me a question to ask you, and I mentioned it before we came on the air about this priest came and he prayed with Lincoln. This is in the wake of Willie's death, and said he's alive. And Lincoln was burst into tears and, like, for the first time realized there's that seems a little overdrawn, such thing as eternal life. But then you have things like there was that famous seance that took place in the White House trying to communicate with Willie's departed spirit. And now we have this novel that came out. I don't know if you read it. I read it, Lincoln and the Bardo. And it imagines Lincoln, sneaking off at night to Willie's grave. It's absolutely amazing. I talk about that kind of Lincoln and the afterlife. And
Well, I think part of the seance, of course, is because of his wife, Mary's.
yeah,
And a lot of people think that she went off, but I think Lincoln does want hope for this. And this son, Willie, was uh, uh, the child most like Lincoln. I mean, you shouldn't have favorite among your children, but he was also the youngest and other things, and sort of had the playfulness and the humor of Lincoln. And at least Lincoln saw a lot of himself in him, and it was extraordinary for him to bear this. And so I do think, as it does today, religion gave Lincoln hope. Um, I don't want to go too far astray, but Lincoln, as a young man, when I talked about the duel, it was very clear that he was ambitious, that he wrote this in his first sort of time he ran. And the only time, a lot of people don't understand this, when I was a child growing up reading all these biographies of Lincoln as a kid in 96, when the bookmobile came every 2 weeks, I'd heard Lincoln lost all these elections and he wins a big one. Well, actually, Lincoln never lost a vote from the people. The Senate was elected by the legislature in Illinois, but the people actually voted in favor of Lincoln, and that was true, except for this very first election. And he's only in New Salem very short time, maybe 2 or 3 months, and he's running and he says the importance of him to be esteemed. That is so important for him, that he needs to count for something. And I really think it was through religion that he came, as I said, to shift from that sense of honor, which is outwardly direction that scholars have pointed to the South, versus a sense of dignity, which is inner honor, that honor from the South depends on what others think of you, to his New Testament understanding of honor, that you don't sit in the seat for the most honored. You take the humble seat, and then God will bless you. What Lincoln understood that many of us, I think, never understand is he read the Bible in its complexity that you talk about. And, we learn in Sunday school that Moses sees the burning bush and then he does what God said. Jonah had a little, help from the digestive juices of a whale, but then he decides to. But over and over again, the Bible implies and says, and Lincoln understood this, that God's time's not ours, God's understanding is not ours, that God calls people to do things. And when you mention the prophets, it's a if, when. And if they don't do it, you see it in Jeremiah, you see it in so many of these, in Ezekiel. If it's not done, it may not get done. Even Paul and Peter sort of refer to this when Paul says that he did not go into a city, therefore that city was not blessed. You see it even, I think, with David's choice for adultery with Bathsheba, that God's blessing is then postponed for David and the house of David, and then it has all sorts of complications. Lincoln understood that complexity, like, I think, better than any theologian. and came to believe that if he did not do God's will, which ended up to be uh, ending slavery, moving us toward a new direction, a new birth of freedom, and primarily holding the Union together as the world's last best hope, then it may not get done. Um, so I'm out skating on a little thin ice, but I've come to believe that I'm right about this. The more I study Lincoln, what he wrote about Providence, this little letter that he did, I don't think he ever mailed, but scholars have been fascinated as he talks about God uh, to himself. Well, I can ramble on and on that, but I'm probably taking you away from where you and your audience want to go. And I didn't talk about the afterlife very much. And Lincoln himself doesn't. It's at this time, incidentally, that they bring in a nurse to take care of Mary. And she does a great thing when you mentioned about Shakespeare. And he's reading every night, he reads his Bible in his chair. And the nurse, he says to her, uh, what is your favorite part of the Bible? And she said, the Psalms. And he says, yes. And he said, it is mine as well. And I have memorized most of it. And I think, you see that reflected throughout Lincoln's um, memorizing the Bible. And as you say, except for the second inaugural, he alludes to it.
The
Sorry
as
about
a
that.
Methodist, I feel inclined
Phone
to
call. I have my phone off.
That's all right. I feel inclined as a Methodist to mention that this is a funny story. Lincoln, he had no patience for the kind of hellfire, brimstone country preaching that he heard, and he actually ran for Congress against Peter Cartwright, who was a Methodist pastor, right? And so during the election, he went to hear Cartwright preach, and Cartwright preached a real hellfire, damnation sermon, and then he called Lincoln out, and he said, "Sir, where are you going? Like to heaven or not?" And Lincoln said, "I'm going to be going to Congress," which is just typical vintage Lincoln. Let's talk about. Let me ask you about. So we mentioned the novel Lincoln and the Bardo. What about just Lincoln in popular culture? In a few minutes at noon, we're going to have our weekly music concert. We're going to hear some Lincoln music, right? John Williams from the Lincoln movie. So you had the Daniel Day-Lewis movie that everybody loved so much, won a bunch of awards. You had that funny Lincoln movie where it's like is it Lincoln and vampires? I don't remember. Talk about sort of Lincoln and
Yeah,
modern culture.
yeah. Well, you mentioned the two movies. I have one of my favorite stories. I was asked to review Lincoln and the Vampire. Uh, so they actually interviewed me, I guess, by the Wall Street Journal. And I had said it was the worst movie I had ever seen. And the book is actually a little bit better. It's got some interesting ideas behind it that vampires are living off of enslaved black people's blood. So you can see the images there. And then the movie, I was surprised, was not as good because the author of the book was a playwright. And then the other book I was asked to review, and the other movie, which is the one that won all the awards, and I love that movie. But as a historian, when I tried to review it, it has so many historical inaccuracies that I was afraid if I reviewed it, people would think that I didn't like the movie. And yet I think the essence of the movie is like fiction and history. You can do some things in fiction like Bardo, the novel we both like. You can do things there that you cannot do as a historian. So when you claim historical accuracy, you have to be a little more careful. But then later, I was introduced in the noted historian Eric Foner at a conference, and someone asked him, I was on the stage with, what did he think of the Lincoln movie? And he reminded people that there were two Lincoln movies. The first one was The Vampire Hunter, and he really liked that one. He didn't care much for the second one. So I've been careful ever since how you know, a little ashamed that I'd said Vampire Hunter was the worst movie I'd ever seen. But I think Lincoln, we all read ourselves into Lincoln, at least most people used to. Things have changed. As I said, the culture wars have been hard. The libertarian movement, which has grown, I think, in America during the cultural wars, uh, because Lincoln brought on big government and the war. he every other politician, major politician, I think, would have let the South leave. Even Seward, who was considered much more hard nosed than Lincoln, suggested just let South Carolina and the South go. Garrison had argued it'd be the best thing, the great abolitionist, be the best thing to let the South go. But Lincoln understood, and I think this gets into his providence of how he saw God using him, what was going on at this time. Lincoln was a great student of history. He loved to read and he read newspapers. And we forget what's happening because we know the result of the Civil War. But starting with the American Revolution, there had been, of course, the French Revolution, and republics grew everywhere. Mexico was a republic. And it looked like the idea of monarchy was dying. The idea that men, because it was men that voted, I'm sorry about the sexist language gendering of that, but that men could rule and govern themselves. It was no longer a hierarchical society, and Lincoln hates hierarchy. Hate is a strong word after just saying that malice toward. He doesn't like the idea of hierarchy. He doesn't like the idea that people can benefit off of other people's labor. And he believes in the rule of law. I mean, those are fundamental things for him. So Lincoln understands that instead of the South being an exception, that all the other republics are fading. Napoleon takes over the republic and puts himself on the throne. And by then, Napoleon III even puts Maximilian, gets rid of the republic in Mexico. So Lincoln's understanding is that if the United States does not survive, this movement away from a hierarchy where it's God rules through the king, and then the king understands God's thing instead of individual people, is doomed. So that's when he talks about the last best hope. He's referring to more of that. And we must remember that Lincoln, it's not true that Lincoln built with his own hands the log cabin he was born in, but he was born in a log cabin with a dirt floor. I mean, he worked hard and he believed in hard work. He believed in meritocracy, that one should be rewarded for their work. And even this gets to be biblical, the virgins with the oil and those without the oil. I mean, he expounds on all these sorts of things. And if democracy, republics fail, then the idea that an Abe Lincoln could go from a log cabin to solid middle class and fairly wealthy in Springfield, Illinois, and even the presidents would be gone as well. So that all becomes, I think, in Lincoln, part of the providence as he understands God, as opposed to the simplicity of which both North and South. In fact, one of the things that I feel very strongly is almost everybody else were sure they knew God's will. The abolitionists were sure. I mean, there was so much sin in the world about sin, but all of the reform movements from temperance to food, and it sort of lined up women's rights, prison reform, behind what they believed was the greatest evil, and that was slavery. So if you get rid of slavery, you'd bring on the millennial and help bring Jesus Christ back. We haven't understood that in the South, theologians and major theologians at Yale University, not in the South, argued that a hierarchical society is what God argues, that slavery is endorsed by the Bible. So this group of people, the pro-slavery theorists, believed that this hierarchical slave society, and many thought it should not just be racial slavery, as it was not in the Bible, racial slavery, was the best way to bring on the millennium, bring Jesus Christ back. It was the best society. Lincoln stood so far apart from them in saying, knowing God's will. And if you think you're knowing God's will, if you think you're doing God's will, then there's no way you're going to be able to compromise. And I think that's where we were in 1860. We were so lucky to have Lincoln as president, who went beyond that because of his theology. And I think to a large extent, that's where we are today, with the idea that we know God's will and this is what it is. And the people who disagree with us are satanic or evil, and God is condemning them. And it's our duty to put them down, and whether it is verbal or even worse ways. So I think there's a lot we can learn from Lincoln, the second inaugural, his overall theology. And I would argue that his understanding that God was using him, and if he didn't do it, that it might not get done, was an extraordinary accomplishment. I think I mentioned to you that when the ministers were saying that God is on your side, he said it was so much more important that I be on God's side.
Yeah, the way I tend to phrase that nowadays, I'm sure this is right, is that the idolatry of today is political ideology. People believe it's not just that they attach God to their political ideology, their political ideology actually becomes their God. I believe if we follow this line, that salvation will dawn. If we follow the other line, it'll be doom and perdition. And people on both sides think that. And we need some kind of Lincoln voice today to say, well, can we figure out how to get on God's side? And it's not easy, because Lincoln didn't get there easily. He had to wrestle with things. He had to ponder things. He had to go through some suffering himself. The country was ravaged. And out of all that, he came to an immense place of wisdom. Vernon, I pledged to I'd love to talk to you for 4 more hours. That would be great. And next time you're in Charlotte, let's do a distance lunch or something here. But just thank you so much for joining us, for taking the time, and more for just all of your learning and wisdom that you've garnered over many years, and that you've shared it with us today. We're so grateful to you. So Vernon, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, James. I want to say that in this culture of narcissism, I think Lincoln's humility, and I would argue his God-given, God-instructed learning through the Bible, humility in all things, is a real lesson that we can all benefit from, myself certainly not excluded.
Yeah, all of us. Thank you. That's very well said. And friends, thank you for joining us today. It's been a great time together. But be back with us next week. Ken Carter talking about, dementia and the Christian faith. That's going to be super interesting and pertinent and relevant for all of us. So thank you. We have our music concert coming up at noon today. So tune in for that. Thank you, everybody.